Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between the amazing Professor Jamil Zaki and the astounding Professor Robert Sapolsky. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now we are so welcomed back Jamil Zaki to the FAN Speaker Series. We hosted him in late 2019 in support of his first book, The War for Kindness, Building Empathy in a Fractured World. He is a full professor of psychology at Stanford University and director of the Stanford Social Neuroscience Laboratory. He and his colleagues study social connection, including empathy, cooperation, and trust, and develop tools to help people connect more effectively. Jamil has written about human connection for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Business Review, and the New Yorker, among many others. His TED and TEDx talks have been viewed over 3 million times, and in 2019, he was awarded the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, the U.S. government's highest honor for researchers at his career stage. Joining Jamil is his widely acclaimed Stanford colleague, Robert Sapolsky, the John A. and Cynthia Fry Gunn Professor of Biology, Neurology, and Neurosurgery, as well as a research associate at the Institute of Primate Research at the National Museums of Kenya. Professor Sapolsky has studied the effects of stress and stress hormones on the brain in the laboratory, while also conducting studies concerning the relationships among social rank, social affiliation, and stress-related disease in a population of wild baboons. Professor Sapolsky's books for non-scientists include Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, the acclaimed guide to stress-related diseases and coping, Behave, the biology of humans at our best and worst, and most recently, Determined, a science of life without free will. We are so excited to welcome Jamil Zaki and Robert Sapolsky to FAN.
Hello, everyone, and right off the bat, thanks, Jamil, for inviting me to do this. Thanks also to Lonnie and Anne-Marie, and thanks to what I assume to be a fair number of people out there who actually still read, so that's always a good thing for authors. So, Jamil, it struck me, I've often seen what I view as a multi-book arc in authors as to what they have to say and to the extent to which some book is their sequel to implicitly or explicitly and such. You had this great book, 2019, The War for Kindness, which I thought was absolutely wonderful, and which now rereading your newest one, Hope for Cynics, perceiving as having been the logical precursor to it. So for the people out there who have not been wise enough to have already read your first book, give me a synopsis so we can see how that got you to where you are now.
Yeah, absolutely. First, Robert, I want to thank you for being here. It's always such a thrill to be in conversation with you. And I also want to thank Anne-Marie and Lonnie for putting together, and the rest of FAN for putting together this excellent event, and all the folks who are here. Yeah, Robert, you're right. It's interesting to trace people's lives through their work in a way and through their writing. And as you know, for the last 20 years or so, I've studied empathy. That is, people's ability to share, understand, and care about each other's emotions. In other words, to connect with one another. And in my book, The War for Kindness, I made the argument based on my lab's research and lots of other work that empathy is not a trait, something that you either have or you don't have, but rather a skill, something that you can choose in the moment and also build over time. And I tried to introduce readers to lots of strategies that people can use to build empathy, especially when it's hard. For instance, when we are split apart ideologically or burdened with stress and burnout. And I think undergirding that work and a lot of my work is the idea that people naturally want to connect with one another, even and especially in difficult times. And that those connections, doing for others, serving others, actually is one of the healthiest things we can do for ourselves in terms of our mental health, our physical health, and our social health. So if there's one message from War for Kindness and from my lab's work, I guess it would be that there is good in us, in our desire to be there for others, and it's good for us. And that all sounds pretty rosy, I know. And you know, Robert, because of my work, I've sort of been tapped as this kind of ambassador of human goodness, of humanity's better angels, brought in to help people feel good about themselves and our species. But as you also know, one thing that I've kind of carried with me in secret that entire time is that even though I study human goodness and greatly believe in the science, sometimes studying something and understanding it isn't the same as feeling it. And for really most of my life, I've actually had a pretty hard time seeing the good in others personally, even though I study this myself. And it was that split between the way I was experiencing life, which was often quite cynical, and what I knew to be true, which is that people are, in many cases, quite pro-social, that brought me to try to explore, well, what was going on with me? Why is this so difficult for me to perceive? And then as I studied the science of cynicism, I realized how big a problem this was, and I became fascinated in, well, why is it so hard for so many of us to tap into the goodness of other people?
Well, in some ways, given that, I would guess, a lot of what got you from the 2019 book to the new one is the 2019 empathy is not a fixed quantity. You could boost up the maximum amount of it in people. You could understand the ways in which it could be girded by anxiety, xenophobia, things like that. Um, but I'm guessing, like over the last 4 or 5 years or so, there's been a lot of junctures where you would say, all of this would be so much easier to implement if there weren't so damn many cynics out there. And thus we have the next book. How is that somewhat of an accurate arc in terms of you identifying what's a major impediment to making the world empathic, that we kind of overvalue cynicism?
I think that's right. And again, I want to be really clear that when I talk about cynicism, and I am going to refer to cynics in this conversation, maybe say some things that are not so positive about cynics, that I'm also talking about myself, that I'm not trying to call out a group of people because I think we all experience this. I'll give you an example, right? My first book came out in 2019, and of course, shortly thereafter, the world experienced the COVID pandemic. And that's probably when my cynicism rose to its highest. So many of us were experiencing humanity not through one-on-one personal connections, but through our screens, through the news, through social media. And because of that, I think many people became more cynical. And one way of testing that is by asking people, what do you think happened during the pandemic? Do you think that it increased human kindness, decreased human kindness, or did it stay the same from before the pandemic? And I, because of what I was seeing on the news, was convinced that people had basically gone feral, that they were fighting each other over toilet paper in grocery stores and flouting public health regulations. I thought that the pandemic had brought out humanity's worst. And most people that I surveyed in 2023 agreed with that conclusion. Barely 20% of people believed that the pandemic brought out our best. But if you look at survey data from around the world, it turns out that indeed, during the pandemic, compared to the years before, people donated to charity more, helped strangers more, and volunteered more. Even during one of the hardest times in many of those people's lives, they showed up for each other. So it was fascinating to me that there was this uptick in human kindness that virtually no one saw, even though it was all around them. And that was one case study for why there was this great divergence between what people were doing, which was wonderful, and what we were perceiving, which in many cases was terrible.
Well, in terms of that, and one of the things you emphasize as one of the true dangers of cynicism is we have a propensity towards deciding that people who are cynical are smarter, are
Mm.
more informed. They really know what's going on behind all of our backs, things of that sort. First off, where do you think this view comes from? And how emphatically can you reject the notion that more cynical and wiser go hand in hand?
Yeah, this is what's known as the cynical genius illusion, and it's not new. The writer George Bernard Shaw once said, The power of accurate observation is commonly called cynicism by those who haven't got it, right? And I think this is a pervasive stereotype in our culture that if you're snarky and sneering and kind of mean-spirited, that must be because you've been around the block enough times. You've accrued some wisdom. And if you believe in people, then you're a chump. You're a rube, right? And the opposite of cynicism to many people is naivete, gullibility. And I think that's in part because when you trust somebody and screw up, it's really obvious. You get taken for a ride, you get defrauded, and people can see that you failed. When you don't trust people and you're wrong to not trust them, that missed opportunity is invisible to you and to the people around you. So you can make mistakes as a cynic and still not seem like you've made a mistake. Whereas if you trust and make a mistake, it's quite obvious. But as you said, part of my mission with Hope for Cynics is to defrock cynicism and take it off of its pedestal. And indeed, that's pretty easy to do when it comes to cleverness. So it turns out that if you ask people who is smarter, a cynic or a non-cynic, 70 people think cynics are smarter than non-cynics. 85% of people think cynics are socially smarter. For instance, that they'd be able to tell who's lying and who's telling the truth more than somebody who trusts others. But actually, the opposite is true in both cases. Data from hundreds of thousands of people demonstrates that cynics do less well on cognitive tests than non-cynics, and they are worse at spotting liars than non-cynics. So even though cynicism masquerades as wisdom, it actually turns out to be quite naive in its own way. Cynics might not unthinkingly trust people, but they unthinkingly mistrust people, which is just as terrible a strategy.
Well, in terms of sort of cynicism having such a clear downside, all of that, there's a danger layered on top of it, which is the negativity of cynicism skates really, really close to something that you and I, for a living, have to value a whole lot, which is skepticism. What do you see as the difference between cynicism and skepticism?
Yeah, it's a crucial distinction and one that I wish more people understood. So cynicism, and we can define it as not the ancient Greek school of philosophy, but the modern definition of cynicism, is the belief that people in general are selfish, greedy, and dishonest. It's an assumption, a bleak and blanket assumption about our entire species. Skepticism is not the belief that people are selfish or that they're unselfish. It's the desire for information and data before drawing any conclusion. So the way I often think about it is that cynics consider humanity as though they are lawyers in the prosecution against it, right? They're looking to make a case. And so they look for evidence that people are awful and focus on that evidence as much as they can, and they ignore or explain away evidence about human goodness. Whereas skeptics think more like scientists. They don't come to the table with an argument. They don't have a case that they're trying to make, but they take in information as it comes to them. And because of that, skeptics, unlike cynics, are able to learn in an agile way about the world around them. They're able to adapt to new situations and people and to build relationships while still not being taken advantage of.
Okay, and sort of reflecting that there's a difference between how much you trust people and how much you trust information and data. Your book has this wonderful 2x2 matrix of sort of how trusting are you of other people, how much faith do you have in data, and you characterize 4 different profiles you wind up with. Tell me about it. Tell us about it.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think that when you think about one, what is your general view of people? And we can imagine that on a horizontal axis. And then how data driven are you? And you can imagine that on a vertical axis. One thing you discover when you consider people in that way is that cynics actually have way more in common with the naive chumps that they love to make fun of than they would probably want to admit, because they differ in their baseline assumptions about people. Naive trusters believe that people are good kind of no matter what happens to them. And cynics believe that people are pretty terrible no matter what happens. And yet, neither one of these folks or groups of people pays much attention to the data. They both rest in their assumptions no matter what happens, right? If you move up towards people who are more empirical, more scientific, you get to skeptics. And there can be different types of skeptics. Like I myself tend to, again, be relatively gloomy, even though I study kindness and empathy. And so I would be what you might call a suspicious skeptic. My default position is to be a little bit defensive, a little bit suspicious, but I'm open to evidence. And if people show me that they can be trusted, I'm willing to move and change my judgments and change my behavior. A lot of us are hopeful skeptics, and that's probably, in fact, the healthiest place to be in many ways. And a hopeful skeptic is somebody who is open to evidence, interested in data, but who also understands that in many cases, our baseline assumptions about other people are too negative. So when we pay closer attention to the data, pleasant surprises are everywhere, and people are often better than we realize.
So when you look at sort of our landscape these days, what's the favorite examples that come to mind for you of circumstances where everybody, a majority of people have basically a cynical, pessimistic view about what other people are like, which turns out to be grossly incorrect in or out of a political context?
Yeah, I mean, I think the obvious case here is our social media and general media ecosystem, right? I mean, we as human beings, and you know this very well, Robert, we have a tendency to focus on threatening information more than positive information. This is what's known as negativity bias. So we visually we look more at threatening than pleasant information. We remember negative events more than positive events. We make decisions more based on what we don't want to lose than what we do want to gain. And our media ecosystem has hypercharged that negativity bias because it's what we pay attention to. And in an attention economy, media companies trade in whatever will keep us clicking and scrolling and watching. And so if you look at media over time, like over the course of the 21st century, the amount of headlines that feature words related to anger has increased by 100% since the year 2000. The number of headlines that feature fear has increased by 150%, right? So anger and fear way overrepresented in our media landscape. And on social media, when people express anger and fear, their posts are more likely to be boosted algorithmically. So in essence, when we go into our media landscape these days, we're entering not a veridical, realistic representation of what people are like. We are entering a room of funhouse mirrors where but it's very unfun, actually. It should be an unfun house mirror, I suppose, where what we see is the most extreme, most negative information that we can, and as many representations of people doing horrible things as our screens can possibly feed to us. And that leads to a greater amount of cynicism over time.
What have been some of the most striking uh, dislocations between what Republicans and Democrats each predict about the other group and what turns out to actually be the case? Because I found those in your book to sort of flatten me with revelation and depolarization.
I mean, I think this is one of the things that fascinated me the most when I was researching for the book is just how fantastically wrong we are about each other, right? I mean, cynicism, because it's this actually quite naive way of viewing people, because it's a credulous way of taking the worst information that we have as the best evidence for who people are, leads us to these really strange places. And of course, partisan media feeds us representations of the other that are systematically as awful as they can be. And we, at the same time, have withdrawn from in-person communication with people we disagree with, right? So Americans in particular have sorted. We spend far less time with people on the other side of ideological issues than we used to. And as a result, what we see about others tends to be whatever we see on social media or legacy media, like cable news. And so, because of that, to your question, Robert, we are wrong on almost every dimension. We're wrong about the demographics of people on the other side. For instance, Democrats believe that 38% of Republicans earn more than $250,000 a year, when in fact, 2% of Republicans earn more than that amount of money. But we're also wrong about what the other side thinks. When asked what the average person on the other side believes, both Democrats and Republicans answered that that person is more extreme than 80% of actual people on the other side. We also think that people on the other side are twice as hateful as they really are, twice as anti-democratic as they really are, and 4 times as violent as they really are. So we, in a real way, in the US at least, are fighting phantoms. We have this boogeyman representation of who's on the other side. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't real extremists on every side of every issue in politics. But what we're doing is taking those extremists and confusing them with the average member of the other party.
So from that, what are some of the most striking arenas in which, in fact, a majority of Democrats and majority of Republicans, sizable majorities are in fact perfectly in agreement with each other? You cite some very reassuring ones to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. So for instance, the majority of Republicans and Democrats want to take money out or reduce the role of money in politics. For instance, by overturning Citizens United. Most Republicans and Democrats are in favor of voting rights and don't like things like gerrymandering that reduce the capacity of people to represent themselves in democracy. The vast majority of Republicans and Democrats also want a more peaceful political climate. And that's one thing that we don't realize about each other. Each group thinks the other is spoiling for a fight. And so we arm ourselves thinking that we have to defend the gate. But really, the other side is defending themselves from what they view us to want, which is war, right? I mean, in fact, people on both sides desperately want a more peaceful and civil society, but don't think that they can afford it because they think they're the only ones who want that.
And insofar as those are led by the extremes at both ends, and that we have this sort of retrospective bias to decide the voices that scream the loudest or most flamboyantly are the ones that leave the biggest impact and get over appreciated. It seems like an additional layer that's really been adding to this problem is this phenomenon where, in fact, counter evidence makes you cling to your nutty belief even stronger than before, because there's this cynical undercurrent of, whoa, if the opposition has to like trot out stuff like that, they must really be scared if they're bringing in experts to say, no, actually, the earth is not flat or things of that sort. How much do you see all of that being fed by, I don't know how uniquely polarized this period is in this phenomenon where counter evidence makes extremists even more extreme?
Yeah, it's an ironic and sad effect. And, I think that we in our politics are in a state of ambient threat. And Robert, you've done such foundational work on what stress does to our bodies and the way that social instability leads to a chronic sense of stress, right? And I think that in our culture, many people feel as though the other side doesn't just disagree with them, but wants to conquer or destroy them in some way. And if you feel like you're existentially threatened, you will raise your defenses even against facts and evidence. I think one really interesting piece of evidence from the science here, though, is that instead of trying to argue people out of their opinions, one of the better things we can do is start by attacking their cynicism first. So my friend Rob Willer and our colleague here at Stanford in sociology, he has found that one of the best things you can do before people listen to the opinions of the other side is learn that, hey, folks on the other side, they want peace. They do not hate you. They want to find compromise. They want democracy to prevail. And when you give people real evidence about what the other side wants, they can open up a little bit more. And then the second thing is to not pelt people with facts so much, which again can raise their defenses ironically, but rather to share stories and one-on-one connections across difference. Because interestingly, cynicism is pervasive as hell on our screens, right? In our media ecosystem. Where you see a lot less cynicism is in real life, in analog connections between human beings. And when you get people together, naturally they tend to rehumanize one another and to replace cynicism with at least a modicum of trust and understanding.
And sort of apropos of that, what I find to be an enormously powerful statement is you cannot reason somebody out of a viewpoint that they weren't reasoned into in the first place. If you don't get at what the core fear is, the core anxiety, the core discomfort with ambiguity and uncertainty, things of that sort, as that as absolutely central to where so much of our problems come from, you don't really develop an attitude about, for example, what our trade deficit with Zambia should be like, built on rationality. It's this world of why 5-year-olds can look at pictures of two candidates, and on the average, they could pick out at a significantly higher than chance level who is going to be the winner of that election, because we're queuing in on all sorts of emotive stuff and trying to attack it, trying to diffuse it on a cognitive level, at best doesn't do you much good. And then, as you say, in these nutty circumstances where it makes for the polarization even worse. So given that, and sort of this wonderful category you brought up of being able to be a skeptical optimist or an optimistic skeptic, what do you see as the difference between optimism and hopefulness?
Yeah, this is another great distinction to raise. So, optimism is the belief that the future will turn out well. And it's a feeling that's associated with happiness and well being, but also sometimes complacency. Because if you think that everything's bound to turn out great, then you don't really have to do much in order to make that happen. And optimism, as such, can also lead to disappointment. Because if you're sure that the future will turn out well and it doesn't, it's like your assumptions are shattered. And actually, I think that optimists are often at risk of turning into cynics if their expectations are not met. Hope is different. It's the belief that the future could turn out well, not that it necessarily will. And I know that sounds similar, but in the uncertainty of hope is a chance for our actions to matter. So the way that psychologists think about hope is that it includes envisioning a future that you want that could occur but might not, envisioning a pathway to that future, a road between here and there, and then feeling a sense of agency to walk that path through our actions. So, whereas optimism can be a little bit complacent, a little bit passive, hope is active and practical. And when people engage, hopefully, with their future, they tend to take more action. And because of that, be more likely to achieve their goals because they sort of gravitate or magnetize themselves towards a future they want through the actions that they take.
Now, the absence of hope has sort of an undercurrent running through it, which puts us into a more clinical realm, which is having no hope is feeling helpless. Is feeling hopeless, is feeling as if you have no power, you have no predictability as to what's coming at you, all of that, which in many ways is a description of clinical depression. And in a sense, clinical depression is sort of this pathologic overgeneralization of the reality of one circumstance where indeed you are or were helpless and deciding this is a worldview. In that regard, you should see cynicism as a hugely exacerbating force in the face of vulnerability to depression.
I love this, Robert. This is a really great point you're making. And I often think about cynicism as almost a form of social depression, right? Where it's absolutely true that probably almost all of us have been hurt at some point. Somebody has harmed us, somebody has done something that disappointed us. And disappointment is lowering our expectations of a person because of their previous action. But I think that oftentimes cynics turn disappointment into what we might call pre-disappointment. That is, overgeneralizing and lowering our expectations of all people in order to not be hurt again. It's a sort of defensive crouch that we enter after being hurt, the same way that somebody with depression might have a truly negative experience where they're helpless, but then generalize and decide that's just who I am. Cynics decide that's just who people are. And in both cases, for the desire to be safe, to not experience something negative again, we actually tragically shrink the circumference of our lives. We lose opportunities and end up making things worse through a general belief, through turning a negative experience into a general worldview.
Well, within sort of considering depression as part of it, there's one like major wrinkle in there, which is, as a sort of textbook by now, depression is not just about negative affect, it's about a cognitive style, which is one reason why cognitive behavioral therapy can be so effective. It is making a cognitive distortion that the reality of one failure, one setback, one case of abandonment, of unrequited way, is in fact the inevitability, and it's generalized everywhere. Admit that, okay, so depression cognitively distorted, you're distorting, this doesn't apply to the circumstance. There's this whole unexpected wrinkle of domains where people who are clinically depressed are in fact more accurate predictors of the nature of the world, which has given rise to the soundbite in the field of depression, sadder but wiser.
Mm.
And a characteristic of that is when someone with depression is assessing some event that is of no emotional relevance to them as an objective outsider, they tend to be more accurate than your average person is, because the average person is pathologically optimistic, especially Americans, from
Yeah.
the point of cross-cultural stuff. It's only when you see that the subject goes closer and closer to where the emotional scabs are in the person, that depression pushes you in the more distortive direction. How much do you see like cynicism that also not only makes us more depressed, but also gets in the way of getting the advantages of when depressives are indeed sadder but wiser?
Wow, that's a great question. And, depressive realism is such a fascinating topic, right? The sadder but wiser effect. And there are cases in which most of us, as you said, are pathologically optimistic. We think that if we went to Vegas, we would win, even though most people lose. We think that our likelihood of getting cancer is lower than the base rate, even though we have no reason to believe that. But it's also true, as you're expressing, that when you get closer to a person's own life, depressive realism turns into incredibly unrealistic beliefs like I'm worthless or everybody hates me. And one thing about those beliefs is that they don't stay just beliefs. They leak into our actions and become self-fulfilling prophecies. So a depressed person who believes that nobody likes them won't call any of their friends and won't return their friends' calls. And eventually, their friends will stop calling, and that person will have more evidence to support their claim, even though their claim once was wrong, that actually nobody is connected with them anymore. And I think that cynics, likewise, they like to think that they are accurate. I know when I'm cynical, I feel very accurate, and I feel like everybody else is pathologically optimistic about each other. But it's also true that when we are cynical, we act in ways that bring out the worst in others and make it more likely that our cynical predictions feel wise. I'll give you an example from my hometown of Boston. Around the turn of the century, around the year 2000, there was a new fire chief who took over in Boston, and he noticed that firefighters were taking sick days. They could take unlimited sick days because of how dangerous their work was. And he noticed they were taking more sick days on Mondays and especially Fridays than any other day of the week. And he thought, aha, these people are cheaters. They're malingering and they're not going to do it anymore on my watch. And so he imposed this new policy. Boston firefighters would be capped at 15 sick days a year. If they took more, they'd have to bring in basically a doctor's note. And even if they were injured, they had to go before a medical board to prove that they were injured. In essence, he was creating a policy to protect himself and the city against what he viewed as a roving band of cheaters. Well, if you looked at it, it was actually only about 3% of firefighters who were probably abusing the system. 97% of them acting in extremely honorable ways. But after he implemented this policy, the number of sick days that firefighters took increased by more than 100%. And the number of firefighters who took exactly 15 sick days increased by 1,000%, by tenfold. And the idea here is that by treating people cynically, by assuming that people were trying to cheat, the fire chief created circumstances where the firefighters felt dishonored and disrespected. And because of that, they reacted by becoming more selfish, in essence saying, well, if you think that I'm a cheater, I guess I might as well become one. And oftentimes, cynics, thinking that they're accurate, end up treating people in ways that make them accurate because they bring out the worst in others.
Well, you could probably identify with sort of an example of this I saw back before your time at Stanford. There was a certain administrator who will go unnamed, who, in my department, biology department, everybody does their teaching, and like some people like it more than others and whatever, but it all sort of balances out. And this person, in a somewhat authoritarian manner, said, I am imposing a minimal teaching requirement on you guys in a way that seemed disrespectful, unkind, a lack of understanding our culture, which was taking care of it, all of that. And okay, geez. And what the outcome was that the minimum amount of teaching that was dictated to us by fiat became de facto the maximum amount of teaching anyone was willing to do.
Mm.
Because in a sense, all you do under those circumstances, if you do more than the minimum required, is to be an acquiescent fool. And I think that's kind of exactly where we get these problems from. This brings to mind something you spent a wonderful stretch of the book looking at, sort of the difference between exchange relationships and communal relationships. Maybe talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So exchange relationships are connections between people where you monitor how much value each person is bringing to the relationship and make sure that it evens out. Like going to a restaurant is one example of that. You would never go to a restaurant and at the end of a fine meal say, wow, can I talk to the chef? Chef, that was delicious. Thanks so much for having me. Next time, come over to my house and I'll cook for you, right? That would not be appropriate in a market, in a free market. Communal relationships are the opposite. They're connections between people where we don't measure how much, we don't keep score of how much each person is contributing, right? I mean, it would be just as odd if my daughters made me pancakes and scrambled eggs for Father's Day and I tipped them $1.50, right? And said, thanks so much, you're doing a great job, right? So there are different spaces in which it makes sense to have exchange relationships and to have communal relationships. I think one problem is that cynicism makes us view communal relationships as though they are exchanges. A cynic believes that people want to take from us. And because of that, a cynic has a hard time being vulnerable and open to relationships where they don't keep score. They tend to keep score more because they worry that other people will take advantage of them if they don't. And that's a minor tragedy that happens, I think, millions or billions of times a day. Because when we treat communal relationships as though they're exchange relationships, we lose the depth and beauty of mutual devotion that people have in our deepest connections. And when you lose that, you lose not just one of the best parts of life, but one of the healthiest parts of life. As you know, Robert, people who are cynical tend to not just be mentally less healthy than non-cynics, but also physically less healthy. They tend to have greater cellular inflammation, greater incidence of heart disease. They even die younger than non-cynics. And I think that's in part because they can't tap into the deeply de-stressing and healthy effects of communal relationships, of deep and frankly loving ties between people.
Well, almost as an aside, it's always struck me there's one domain where communal relationships are very, very bad and very dangerous, which is when the state, with a capital S, expects you to be having a communal relationship with them. And that's when you see words like the fatherland creep in,
Wow.
that you are expected to have a certain non-quantitative loyalty, obeisance, being willing to jump off a cliff for them, that being the dangerous realm. But something where it tilts the other way, you make a very nice point, which I think will resonate with anyone out there here listening who's a parent who has watched the teenager and trying to help them navigate it. The ways in which social media are brilliant at turning communal relationships into exchange relationships.
Oh yeah, I mean you see it everywhere, and it's tragic, of course, to see how it affects people in general, but especially young people. I mean, that's one of the things that that I think has changed most during my lifetime is just how much we quantify. I mean, quantification and counting are the domain of exchange relationships. I mean, that's what we do with money. And that's why you try not to bring money into friendships or personal relationships, because it's naturally puts us in an exchange frame of mind. But now we count everything. We count how many steps we take, how many calories we consume, how many minutes we meditate and sleep. And as you're saying, social media takes that quantification creep and dumps it into all of our relationships with one another, where we can monitor popularity at a minute level and compare ourselves to each other at any dimension we want, which is absolutely corrosive to the ability to commune with others. I think, especially during adolescence, people's desire to compare each other and to rank themselves against each other is completely natural and also in many cases quite destructive. And it's bound to happen, who can run fastest, who looks best in that, in that outfit. But what social media does is absolutely allow us to constantly, 24 hours a day, count up who is succeeding more than who else, right? And it turns would-be friends into competitors in a social marketplace. And that competition, I think, is like an acid bath for communal connections, especially among young people. And you see the effects of that in the mental health and social relationships of young people now.
And because implicit in that is the really difficult thing to keep in mind, which is what everyone is presenting out there is curated and sanitized and the edges tucked in and your dirty laundry and your insecurities. And it's very hard to remember that these are apples and oranges and that the system is set up to allow people to present themselves in a way that's enormously distortive. You have a quote, wonderful quote from the addiction psychiatrist Anna Lemke, who's our colleague at Stanford, and I thought brilliant quote to the effect of, as soon as you can quantify something, you've opened the door to addiction to
Yeah.
it, which I think is so damn insightful. It seems like the corollary here is, as soon as you can quantify something, you've taken the spirit out of it. You have taken the non-competitive aspects. You have guaranteed it's now an exchange relationship and friendships and how loved you feel in the world, not by how many thumbs up you were getting on some screen. That's a terrible danger in terms of taking everything that is communal about trusting and feeling efficacy with other people and completely torpedoing it in a way that is meant to make us feel like failures on top of that.
I think that's right. And, it also points to a benefit and a strategy that we might employ if we want to recommunalize our relationships, to deepen and strengthen relationships, which is to uncount, to deliberately and intentionally create spaces in our social world where we are not keeping track of how much value people are providing or where people stand. And that's one easy way to do that is to just shut off our phones and social media accounts. And of course, that's a strong movement these days, but it goes beyond that. I think that there are many cases in which it's just a psychological temptation to keep score. It's just something that we are prone to do, but it's something that once we notice it, we can resist and we can hit the pause button on. And one of the things that I find in my own work is that when people act kindly towards one another, it's healthiest for them, for the kind actor, when they don't focus on what they owe the other person or what the other person owes them, but instead focus compassionately on why they care about that person and the good that they hope to do for them. So rotating our perspective around social connections away from, well, who's given more and who's gotten more, and towards why are we here? What do I want with this person, not what do I want from this person? That can be a really useful way to fight against this quantification creep.
Well, in that regard, there's sort of a quip or something in the stress field of this guy comes in and he's not healthy and he's got high blood pressure and he's under enormous amounts of stress and he's workaholic and sort of affectless, joyless life. And the doctor says you need to scale back and you need a hobby. And he thinks, and the guy says, well, I've always thought it might be fun to paint. Okay, go do some painting and see if that helps. And, the patient calls up the doctor 2 days later and says, Doc, this is great. I've already done 6 paintings. No, that's kind of not the metric or something. Numbers in the wrong place are disastrous in the same way that communal relationships, when you're talking to somebody in a brown shirt, can be disastrous as well. I mean, that kind of brings to a political point you had lurking in the book that really struck me. Like, what's one of the metrics for when a society, a culture is not doing well? This concept of social capital. How much social capital is there in society? And it comes down fairly reliably to 2 metrics. Take somebody and ask them, on the average, can people be trusted? What percentage of people say yes to that? And to say, how many organizations do you belong to?
Mm-hmm.
When you've got people in a society where people don't trust each other much and they don't belong to organizations, parentheses, things that mean virtually by definition collective efficacy, that's a mark of a society's in trouble.
Yeah.
Now, in a circumstance, if you're a have-not in a society like that, what cynicism may be is, in fact, incredibly accurate in all of that. Your point that blew me away is what happens when it's the powerful who are the cynics?
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that when powerful people are, let me actually start with where you did, which is, I think it's perfectly reasonable in many cases for people who don't have much power to feel mistrustful of people who do. None of what I write about in Hope for Cynics is, hey, just trust the government and trust, elites in media and everything will be fine, right? I think that you can absolutely be hopeful and still speak truth to power, challenge structures around us. In fact, I think hope can be quite radical. The problem is when people who don't have power don't feel mistrustful of the government or of elites, but rather of each other, when they lose that social trust that you're talking about. And that's when, as you're saying, social capital collapses. That also happens to help people who are in power. As you're alluding to, people in power often experience some cynicism where they want to control people and they don't trust the people in their society. And one of the ways that they can hold on to that power is by reducing the capacity of citizens to band together, by reducing social capital. In fact, Hannah Arendt, in her book on totalitarianism, says that the goal of a totalitarian state is not to make people believe their lies, but rather to stop people from believing anything. Because if people mistrust one another, then they're easier to control.
And in a sense, what that does endlessly is reinforce the status quo, because the thing lurking between the lines there is nothing can be changed, nothing. Who benefits the most from everyone deciding nothing could be changed? The person sitting in the upper 1%, the person sitting in the palace, all of that. Cynicism is not just it's a very powerful tool for the powerful, because it's basically trying to convince the others that they are indeed helpless, which seems like an enormously important point.
I think it's one of the things that strikes me as important about that is that it's the opposite of what a lot of people believe. I mean, since I started working on this book, and certainly since it came out, I've heard from lots of people who have positive things to say, but also a fair number of people who say, Hope, what a privileged, blinkered perspective. Hope is a tool of the status quo, and cynicism is necessary because we need to mistrust authority. To which I would say, actually, it's in many cases the exact opposite, as you're beautifully laying out, Robert. Oftentimes, cynicism turns out to be a tool of the status quo. Cynicism, especially when people mistrust one another, is a great way to keep things as they are. Of course, cynics see problems, and there are real and vast problems in our culture, but they don't see any solutions. They imagine that the broken parts of our culture and system reflect our broken nature, reflect who we really are. And if you believe that, there is no way out. By contrast, if you look at the history of social movements, radical social movements around the world, they are fueled by people who experience two things. One, righteous fury at injustice, inequality, and corruption. And two, a deep belief in each other, a belief in the common citizen and in the idea that most of us want the same thing. Most of us want a more sustainable, egalitarian, and peaceful world. When you combine those two things, anger and hope, you get what Martin Luther King called creative maladjustment. Not feeling happy, not feeling well adjusted in an unjust world, but being creative and realizing that another future is possible.
And thus, in a sense, one may feel badly for, some empathy for someone whose cynicism is mostly making their life worse. Be really careful when a cynicism from somebody is designed to make you feel more helpless and hopeless. Um, Sort of apropos of that is we're sort of winding down here. The obvious like hopeless question. So where are the interventions? What are you most optimistic about?
I think that so it might surprise folks out there to know that I started out this process of writing this book from a pretty gloomy place personally. And it turns out that marinating myself in the science of cynicism and mistrust and hopelessness has actually made me much more hopeful as an individual, because I realize that so much of cynicism is merely a cognitive distortion. We really are not just gloomy and bleak and sad when we are cynical, we're often wrong. And so, oftentimes, and many of the interventions to build hope and fight cynicism don't require lying to people or faking until you make it. They simply require paying closer attention to the data about what people are really like, whether those data come from our own life and our relationships, from tests that we can, experiments that we can run in our life, trying to trust people a little bit more, or by actually looking at the scientific data about what people are like. You mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the most effective treatments for depression. That entails helping people who are suffering with depression just look more accurately at their lives and at what people in their lives are really like. I believe strongly that a data-driven case, just being more attentive, being more open, being more skeptical, can help any of us fight cynicism in our own lives. And if we can aerosolize that same hopeful skepticism, we might be able to fight cynicism in our culture writ large as well.
Good. Well, in that case, that leads me to what I was assuming would be an obviously answered question, final question, when you first talked to me about doing this back in June, but which, because of events in recent months, make for a very different landscape now. So, what's your cynical, non-cynical, hopeful, unhopeful, optimistic, despairing take on what's going to happen in this country at the beginning of November? If you know what I mean.
I think we've had a real change, of course. I mean, a concrete change in the outlook for this fall. But one thing that I've really noticed is that there is at least among people on the Democratic side of the aisle, a renewed sense of possibility. And you see, and as we talked about, hope is a belief in a future that people want and a pathway towards that future. And when those two pieces fall into place, what do people do? They walk that path. So you don't just see people saying that they're happier now or more hopeful. You see them volunteering more, donating unprecedented amounts of money to their candidate, and acting as though maybe, just maybe, the future that they want can be achieved.
Well, I sure am clutching on to that as well, as I believe lots of us are. So on that note, I hope what everyone has taken from this is you can be hopeful, you could be optimistic, you could be et cetera, you could be energized by, innovative, proactive, and that's not a sign that you're being duped. That's a sign that, according to leading scientists, are that you're actually being more scientifically accurate. So I find that to be wonderful. Great book. If anyone out there does not own a copy, get one, get a dozen. It's a wonderfully encouraging book.
Thank you so much, Robert, for this conversation. It's such a joy to speak with you. And thanks everybody for being here.
Robert, I want to echo our gratitude to you. It was such a beautiful interview. It flowed so well. There's such great both affection and respect between the two of you. You teased out a lot of great pieces from Jamil's book and his research. It was such, my phone has been blowing up with people texting me and they're saying, I can't take notes fast enough. So a couple things I want to underscore. So please, first of all, Robert, thank you so much for your time tonight. I know you're busy with your own new book out as well. So I know we're very grateful for the time. I want to remind folks, Jamil is sticking around for a 55-minute after hours that's going to begin at 8:05. He has so much to offer on this topic and everything that surrounds this topic. I was reading The Galley on the beach in Evanston this summer, and I was texting him or emailing him saying, Jamil, oh my God, this book, it was every 3-4 pages. I felt like I just had to put it down and just like take in. There's so much great stuff in your book. I just loved it. And that's when I made the beachside decision of like, let's do a book giveaway. We're giving away 100 copies of this book tonight to attendees randomly selected from the Zoom report tomorrow morning. We are so thrilled to be doing that. We love pushing out that information, pushing it out to folks and letting them have that surprise and delight and that opportunity to learn. We are also, how do you get to spend another hour with Jamil? Well, we've been putting the links in chat this whole time. We're asking for a meaningful donation to FAN as you define meaningful. So whatever is good for you, come hang out with Jamil. Come ask your own questions. There are so many directions that his research takes. And as you can tell, he can pivot and talk about a whole bunch of things. So we're really excited. I want to know more about I want to talk about the cultivation of cynicism and what is the cultural cultivation of cynicism? Who gets paid big money to make us more cynical? I'd love to learn a little bit more about that. I'm going to pull one question here. You got about 1 minute to answer it if you don't mind. Sylvia was saying regarding social media, can be the king of quantification, but at the same time, it's also the possibility to connect with other like-minded people in meaningful ways. She was thinking of the example of neurodivergent people who sometimes struggle with in-person communication. She wants to know what are your thoughts on social media, how it can also work towards connection and community? So can you shift the lens just a bit? You got about a minute to answer, please.
It's a great question. And there are tons of cases where social media affords us connections that we either couldn't make in our analog lives or that are healthy. And one of the big dimensions that researchers find matters here is what types of connections you are fostering. So in general, directly communicating with people on social media, think direct messages or chats, is a lot more positive for relationships than scrolling, lurking, or posting. So there's much more to say about it, but that's one dimension that seems to make a difference.
Oh, I appreciate, I want to know more about that. So in 5 minutes, I'm going to learn a whole lot more about that. I hope you can. There's a fire truck going by my window right now. Hope it's not too loud. Sorry about that. So right at 8 o'clock, Robert, we hope to welcome you back to Fanland at some point. Thank you so much. Continue good luck on your own book tour as well. Jamil, you got a 5-minute break. Everyone who's coming to after hours, we'll see you in about 5 minutes or so and come back and join Fan both in person and online in the coming months. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great night.